So we think that was quite dramatic, cutting off the king's head, but things got even more exciting. The second part of our story today is called Cromwell's Protectorate. Now that the king was dead, England was no longer a monarchy, a country ruled by a king or queen. The Rump Parliament declared that England now had become a commonwealth, a country where the people rule by electing leaders who will represent them. Parliament was supposed to listen to the people of England and pass laws that the English wanted. But the Commonwealth got off to a bad start. Many Englishmen and women hoped that Parliament's first action would be to reform, which means change for the better, the courts in England. It cost a tremendous amount of money to go to court, and the laws were so complicated that most English citizens had to hire expensive lawyers to help them. Only rich people could make use of the courts. But most of the members of Parliament were lawyers who liked the laws of England just the way they were, complicated and hard to understand. And although the Rump Parliament was supposed to dissolve itself so new leaders could be elected by the people, it never did. 4 years after Charles I was executed, the Rump Parliament was still arguing slowly about whether or not English laws should be changed. Oliver Cromwell was fed up with Parliament. When one of his generals suggested that Parliament should be made up of hand-picked men rather than elected representatives, Cromwell agreed. He and his Puritan friends decided that England's government should be an assembly of saints, men who agreed with the Puritan cause. So Cromwell marched into the Rump Parliament with his soldiers from the New Model Army behind him and declared it dissolved. "You have sat here too long for the good you do," he shouted. "In the name of God, go." The soldiers drove the members of the Rump Parliament out at sword point. Just like Charles, Cromwell had used an English army to threaten other Englishmen. But Cromwell believed that his use of force pleased God. "Perceiving the Spirit of God so strong upon me," he remarked later, "I would not consult with flesh and blood at all." Now that Parliament had been dissolved by force, Cromwell and his army generals appointed a new Parliament made up of 139 men, fearing God and of approved fidelity and honesty. This Parliament became known as the Barebones Parliament after one of its members, a Puritan minister named Praise God Barebones. It was also called the Nominated Assembly because its members were hand-picked or nominated by Cromwell. Cromwell still called England a Commonwealth, but now it was being ruled by his own hand-picked men, not by the people of England. 6 months later, this nominated assembly of men loyal to Cromwell passed a new bill. This bill announced Parliament now gives all of its powers to Oliver Cromwell to act on behalf of the people of England. Oliver Cromwell had become the new King of England. He was never called King. Instead, he was called the title Lord Protector of England, and he was supposed to call Parliament every 2 years and listen to what the members of Parliament advised him to do. But Cromwell certainly seemed like a king. He moved his family into the royal palace. The ceremony to make him Lord Protector looked an awful lot like a coronation ceremony. His advisers often called him Your Highness, and when Parliament refused to do exactly what he said, he scolded its members, telling them that he spoke for God and they were opposing God himself when they opposed the Lord Protector. "I undertook this government in the simplicity of my heart and as before God to do the part of an honest man," he explained. "I speak for God and not for men." When Parliament continued to oppose Cromwell, he announced, "I think that it's not for the profit of England nor for the common and public good for you to continue here any longer, and therefore I do declare unto you that I dissolve this Parliament." Cromwell had the power to dismiss Parliament and the power to rule England as he pleased, but his power didn't make him popular. He directed his soldiers to break up all of the royal regalia used to crown kings, the crown, the sceptre, the coronation ring and bracelets, and even though many Englishmen had hated Charles, they disliked seeing these English treasures destroyed. He allowed his army to wreck churches which seemed too Catholic. So wherever the new model army went, stained glass was broken, beautiful wooden carvings and statues were hacked apart, and lead ornaments were melted and made into bullets. And Cromwell made his Puritan convictions the law of the land. He believed that playing cards was ungodly, so cards became illegal. He thought that going to plays was ungodly, so all of the theatres in England were closed. He believed that God approved only of hymns, so the English were allowed to sing only hymns. Cromwell became so unpopular that 3 years after he became Lord Protector, an anonymous booklet was published encouraging someone to assassinate him. But no one needed to assassinate Cromwell because he was already growing ill. He'd been wounded in battle many times and had never really recovered, and he was suffering from malaria. When his favourite daughter died in the 4th year of the Protectorate, Cromwell became even sicker with grief. In September of 1658, Oliver Cromwell died. He was embalmed so he could have a royal funeral, with his body lying in state while all of England filed past to see him one last time. But the embalming didn't work. Cromwell's body was too disgusting to put on view. So he was hastily buried in Westminster Abbey and a wax figure was put on display. Afterwards, an empty coffin was the centre of a huge funeral. One observer remarked, "It was the joyfulest funeral that I ever saw, for there was none that cried but dogs." Oliver Cromwell's son Richard claimed the title Lord Protector, but the English were tired of the Protectorate. It was just like a monarchy except with more rules. Noblemen who served the army started to argue with each other about who should rule England next. One of the army generals realised that England was on the brink of the greatest civil war yet. He marched into London and called the members of the old Long Parliament back into session. The Parliament met together and decided to send a message to Charles I's son, who'd fled England and was living in France, far away from Cromwell and his soldiers. "Come back and become king," Parliament begged. But even while it planned to welcome Charles II back, Parliament also began to pass laws that would restrict the king's power. From now on, English kings would have to answer to Parliament for their actions. On May the 23rd, 1660, Charles's son, Charles II, returned to England. The English, tired of war and Puritan laws, welcomed him with cheers of joy. The years of the Protectorate were over. The king was back.